Alright, so let's take a look at auto layout for the first time. And to do this, we're going to revisit the stopwatch application that we worked on back on lecture 4. So I'm going to go ahead and open that project up, and I've made a copy of it. And so let's open it up, and let me run the program, the app, so you can remember what it does. So you remember this guy pops up a simple stopwatch, and I can start my timer, I can pause it, restart it, I can clear it when paused, I can switch my viewing mode from day to night. But the problem is, first of all, it's kind of ugly, right? I would expect this to be centered. And furthermore, if I switch orientations, all of a sudden my buttons are gone. Okay, and that's not really what I want. So all of that is bad. And if I switch to a different phone, let's go down to a 4S. Okay, and that's a problem too, right? So I switch to a different screen. This is a lower res, smaller screen, and my buttons are appearing off the screen. So this is exactly the problem that auto layout was designed to handle. So let me switch this back to iPhone 6, and let's go ahead and fix these problems. And we're going to do this in Interface Builder. So let's go over to our storyboard for this application. And the first thing to check is, let's make sure auto layout's on. Now it is on by default in Xcode 6, but if I select this and I go over here to my identity and type screen, you can see right here under the document properties that auto layout is on. The problem is I just haven't given any constraints. I haven't set anything to do that. Now there's some auto layout related controls right here in the interface builder. So over here on the far right is our resolver, and this guy, a lot of times if we click this, it will give us suggestions on what is broken and how to fix it. So that's the resolver, and I've also got a pin functionality here where I can pin the width and the height, and then I've got alignment settings as well where I can select controls and create constraints using this. There's also options to do all of the same thing, so those three menus are also available right here up on the editor menu. So the resolver will basically try to give us suggestions on what's broke. And so if I selected this label right here, okay, I'd kind of like that centered in the middle of the screen, horizontally and vertically. And if I select that and I go to the resolver, okay, one of the things I could do is say reset to suggested. I could just say, what does Interface Builder think I want to do? And if I clicked on that, okay, notice what it did. Okay, it added a bunch of constraints, and I can find those constraints in two places. So the constraints that are pinning, so if I'm just setting a width or a height, okay, those are going to be right under the item over here in my document view on the left. So if I look at this, it created a width of 342, and that's based on the current width of the thing. So it said, oh, that's how big you want it, that's how big you stretched it out to, so that's what I'll set it to. Okay, but then there's also relational type constraints related to other things here, and those are down at the bottom. So you can see leading alignment. Okay, and it's saying, well, this thing is going to be this far from the screen, and if I go over here, when we select this, okay, this guy right here, the size inspector, I can actually see the details of this thing. And I've got the same thing here, center alignment, center Y alignment. Vertical space, well, it says, hey, I just put this 233 down from the top. Okay, that's kind of a magic number, isn't it? Okay, that's one of the problems right there, is if I get on a smaller screen, that's going to be too far down to potentially see, or it's going to be way more than center. Okay, so what it generated here is really hogwash. And part of the problem is I really didn't give it a good clue as to what I wanted to do. Okay, so if I delete, let's just delete all these constraints. So I'm going to select them all, just delete them. Okay, and let's try something a little different here. Okay, first of all, let's get this thing sized more accurately. And then let's drag it till we see the horizontal and vertical center marks. Okay, so when I do that, and now I go down here and say reset. Okay, now let's see what we get. Okay, center X, center Y, okay, but we still got this goofy vertical space 233. Well, I don't want that one, so I'm just going to get rid of that one. Okay, now notice it's centered now. It's got constraints for that, but it's still complaining, and you can tell it's complaining because it's got this little yellow. So there's some warnings here. So if I go in here, it's saying, hey, there's something wrong here. This thing, I would expect it to be 274 wide and a height of, or I would expect it to be at 274 with a height of 53. You got it at 253 with a height of 94. Okay, so what it's doing is it's saying, hey, this thing's actually a lot taller than it needs to be. Okay, and that's good to know. So we should really fix that. And to fix it, I can just click this and say, go ahead and update the frame to match what you're suggesting. Okay, I could also say, no, what I'm doing in the interface builder is right. You set the constraints according to the size of this. Well, I don't really want that here. Okay, so I want to take the first one and reset this to suggested. Says, well, I'm going to delete the constraints altogether and generate brand new ones. So I'm just going to take the first one and say, you're right. Let's go with the smaller size. And now, okay, it's got that right. So let's just check out what we get from doing that. Okay. Now notice those buttons are still out of whack, but I haven't put any constraints on them yet. But what do you think of the label? That looks pretty centered, doesn't it? And if we switch our orientation, what about that? Okay, nice, right? And if I switch to a different size phone, it's still centered. It's good. All right. So let's go ahead and fix the buttons as well. Okay. Now notice this thing is a square, isn't it? It's not very much shaped like a phone at all. Okay, but Apple is trying to get us to stop thinking about specific screen sizes and form factors. They want us to start thinking of this as a canvas, and the actual layout at runtime is going to be based on the system of constraints. That's what they want us to start thinking, because Apple's innovating, right? And if they just have one or two screen sizes, that means they're probably not coming out with new products, right? So there's a watch, right? There's rumors about bigger iPads coming. We'll probably hear a lot in the first or second week of June, whenever WWDC is. There'll probably be some interesting stuff coming. So Apple's getting the development community ready to stop kind of using Interface Builder to hardwire things for specific screens and just lay things out in this rectangle and set up the right constraints, so no matter what happens at runtime, it's going to look pretty decent. And incidentally, down here, we can play around and kind of simulate what this will look like. Okay, see that? So there's a compact form factor. There's a wider one. Here's my height. Okay, there's my iPad. Okay, so you can actually play around.
Without having to build it out.
Right, it doesn't, this is not going to impact anything at runtime, but it lets you kind of after you put those constraints, it will kind of let you look at what this thing's going to look like on a narrower screen versus a wider one and so forth. The other thing you can do is if we select the controller and we go right here. So we can say size. Okay, so inferred means it'll figure it out. Okay, but we can also say, well, what would this look like on a 3.5-inch iPhone? That's what it would look like right now. Okay, now again, this doesn't impact how it's laid out on a 3.5-inch iPhone. This just says if you ran this screen on an iPhone the way you currently got it laid out, that's how it's going to look. Okay, so these don't really tell it, oh, I want you to run on it. This is just for previewing. It's simulating what you're going to see if you run this on a 3.5-inch. So sometimes people get confused by that. So we're going to set that back to that. And let's go ahead and fix these buttons. And to do that, I'm just going to kind of drag these in. Before I try to set constraints on them, I'm going to drag them into kind of logical places. And what I want to do is let's get this thing standard distance from each of the super view's edges, and we'll always pin this thing down to the lower right. And we'll always pin this thing down to the lower left, and then we'll put this thing standard distance from the bottom, but always centered. Okay? Now, all I did was move it. I didn't really set any constraints. So if I run this on a smaller screen, they're still going to disappear. Okay, so now we got to set the constraints. So what I did on the top one was I had it kind of generate the constraints, and then I went in and just tweaked that goofy vertical one, okay, which was probably left over from the first time I placed it. All right, so you can also kind of very explicitly, interactively tell Xcode or Interface Builder to generate the constraints. For example, I can select this guy, and I'm going to control click, and I'm going to move over to the right side or left side. And when it turns blue like that, see how it turns blue? Okay, that's my signal that it now's got the super view, and I'm going to let it go, and it pops up this little window, and it says the top item here is leading space to container margin. And that's what I'm doing. I'm saying set that to standard, and it knows it's standard because I stopped at the blue line. So if I click that, it just created a constraint that says put that thing standard from the left. Now all of a sudden, it's whining about, it's got red, it's got yellow, there's errors in here. And I can see exactly what those are if I click on, oops, this. Oh, there's two of them. So here I'm missing a constraint. I said, hey, this is where I want it to go horizontally, but I've never told it where I want it to go vertically. Now I moved it up to the bottom there, but I didn't set a constraint, right? So that's why it's missing. So I can fix that problem by either going in and saying, add it, all right? And chances are it'll get it right. Or I could do the exact same thing I just did, only go in the other direction. So select it, control click, move to the bottom, and when this thing goes blue, now it's saying, okay, standard distance from there, so it's bottom space to layout guide. I click, bam, fixed. Okay. Now notice when I select this guy, okay, there is no width in height pinning on this, and it's not complaining about it. Well, that's because it's basing the width and the height on the content in the button and saying that's what the width and height is. We got plenty of space there, right? So we can do the same thing over here. So let's start's a little bit different because I'm not going to pin this thing to the wall on the left or the right because when I change devices, that's not going to work for me. I want to center it. So one of the things I could do is I could select that and I could go to the align here. Okay. And I could say vertical centers or horizontal horizontal center in container, or I could go through the menu here. I could say select this guy, editor, align horizontal center in container. Now as soon as I do that, it knows now where it's going to go on the X dimension here, but it doesn't know where it's going to go on the Y. How am I going to fix that? Well, I could probably go up here and get it to fix automatically right here. Or I could do what we did before. I could just say, okay, pin that down like that. Bottom space to layout. Bingo. Now, this one says, hey, this looks like it's a lot bigger than it really needs to be. Okay, so I didn't make that button, I didn't size it quite right. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, fix it. And it's telling me right here, I expected you to be at 184 with a width of 33, but you're actually at 170 with a width of 60. Okay, so I'll just say, well, fix it. So if I update the frame, watch what it does to my start button. It just sucks it in and makes it that size and repositions it. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing on our clear button. Trailing space, it's going to complain obviously until we fix it vertically. Okay, and now once more it's got to complain about the height. It doesn't like it, so I'm just going to let it fix this automatically. Okay, now I have no more auto layout issues, so now I'm going to test it. Okay, that looks beautiful. And if I rotate, oops, sorry, bingo. Okay, and if we run on a different screen, so let's go over to 4S. Nice. Okay, so now no matter what phone you install it on, no matter what orientation you hold it in, my app is always behaving. Now let me show you one more interesting thing. So I'll move this back to 6. And let me delete all these constraints. And by the way, I put this back in compact. But I removed the constraints, right? And I'm going to get rid of this constraint as well. Okay, so all the constraints are gone. Okay, so if I run this now, we're kind of right back to where we were, where things are just going to look bad, right? So let's go in and let's just drag everything using the guidelines. Okay, so I just, no constraints, I just did them all. And then I'm going to select my view right here. I'm going to go down to my resolver. And I'm going to say, you go ahead and figure it out. So I'm going to reset to suggested constraints. Okay, and it added a whole boatload of these. Okay, and before we even look at them, let's just see what it did. Looks pretty good that way, doesn't it? Looks, oop, that one's not right. Okay, it's almost there. So it almost got it. There's obviously a vertical issue. There's a constraint that's screwing this guy up. It looks like there's a hard-coded constraint instead of centering. So if we go in here, vertical space, there it is, right there, 253. So if I delete that one, and now this is, okay, so it didn't have a centered on it. Okay, so we'll go in and add that. So I'm going to select this, say align. Okay, now that fixed it. Okay,